Just 4 days after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Representative John Conyers introduced the first motion to make Dr. King's birthday a federal holiday. It took another 11 years for the federal holiday to come up for a vote on the House of Representatives floor in 1979. It wasn't until 1983 that the bill passed and was signed into law. The first observance of Martin Luther King Jr. Day was 30 years ago today, in 1986. At that time, Coretta Scott King was quoted as saying, "This is not a black holiday, it is a people's holiday." We are gathered here today for a time to remember the past, to consider all that has been accomplished, and to be challenged together by the work that must still be done. We come together today to recognize the continuing relevance and power of Dr. Martin Luther King's words in the letter from a Birmingham jail. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Welcome to the 2016 Martin Luther King Jr. Convocation. I would now like to introduce Will King, who will open our program with an invocation. Will?
Please join me in this invocation. Dear Heavenly Father, we gather here today seeking your presence, taking a moment to pause and reflect upon the progress of our country and community, but also to be reminded of the strides we still have yet to take. Break our hearts for the injustices that still occur in this world, and reveal ways that in this very moment we can serve our neighbors. May we humble ourselves to see one another not based upon race, gender, religion, sexuality, economic differences, or cultural backgrounds, but rather fellow inhabitants of this planet we call Earth. May we serve each other in love and grace, and acknowledge differences as experiences we can learn from. Shall we take advantage of the community we have here to learn from one another, to see the world in new perspectives, and use these various lenses to push us towards a common good? May the characteristics we first perceive not be the things that separate us from one another, but rather embrace our differences and what we have in common, that we all share this very short amount of time here on Earth. Searching for love, acceptance, security, and a purpose. And in this pursuit, may we not be obstacles for one another, but rather a helping hand. May we serve one another before trying to serve ourselves. For when we pause to experience life with another individual, we will realize these are the moments that we should truly strive for. We ask in thy name, amen. Please stand and join the Otterbein Gospel Choir in the singing of the first verse of Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem.
Martin Luther King Jr. worked throughout his life and ministry to build what he called beloved community. King, among others in the civil rights movement, saw beloved community as achievable with the critical mass of people committed to nonviolence, reconciliation, and social justice. The work of creating beloved community is both the legacy and imperative of this day of celebration, and it requires partnership. These readings from King's writings and speeches highlighting our continuing task.
July 1962. Those who adhere to the method of nonviolent direct action recognize that legislation and court orders tend only to declare rights. They can never thoroughly deliver them. Only when people themselves begin to act are rights on paper given lifeblood. This method of nonviolent resistance is effective in that it has a way of disarming the opponent. It exposes his moral defenses, it weakens his morale, and at the same time, it works on his conscience. Nonviolent resistance also provides a creative force through which men can channelize their discontent. It does not require that they abandon their discontent. Discontent is sound and healthy. Nonviolence saves it from degenerating into morbid bitterness and hatred. Hate is always tragic. It is as injurious to the hater as it is to the hated. It distorts the personality and scars the soul. We have come to the day when a piece of freedom is not enough for us as human beings, nor for the nation of which we are a part of. We have been given pieces, but unlike bread, a slice of which does not diminish hunger, a piece of liberty no longer suffices. Freedom is like life. You cannot be given it in installments. You cannot be given breath but not body, nor a heart but no blood vessels. Freedom is one thing. You have it all or you have none, and you are not free. Our destiny is bound up with the destiny of America. We built it up for 2 centuries without wages. We made cotton king. We built our homes and our homes for our white slave masters and suffered injustice and humiliation. But out of a bottomless vitality, continued to live and grow. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not extinguish our existence, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We have that we are the conscience of America. We are its troubled soul.
There are 3 basic attitudes that one can take toward the question of progress in the area of race relations. The first is the attitude of extreme optimism. The optimist would contend that we have come a long, long way in race relations. He would point proudly to the marvelous strides that have been made in the area of civil rights over the last few decades. From this, he would conclude that the problem is just about solved, and that we can sit comfortably by the wayside and wait for the coming of the inevitable. The second attitude that one can take toward the question of progress in the area of race relations is that of extreme pessimism. The pessimist would argue that we have only made minor strides in the area of race relations. He would contend that the present tension is fit testimony to the fact that we have created more problems than we have solved. The extreme pessimist and the extreme optimist have at least one thing in common. They both agree that we must sit down and do nothing in the area of race relation. The optimist says do nothing because integration is inevitable. The pessimist says do nothing because integration is impossible. The third attitude that one can take toward the question of progress in race relations is the realistic attitude. The realistic attitude seeks to reconcile the truths of 2 opposites and avoid the extremes of both. So the realist in race relations would agree with the optimist in saying we have come a long way, but he would balance that by agreeing with the pessimist that we have a long way to go. It is in this realistic position that I would like to set forth this message. We have come a long, long way, and we have a long, long way to go.
June 6, 1961. Through our scientific genius, we have made of this world a neighborhood. Now, through our moral and spiritual development, we must make of it a brotherhood. In a real sense, we must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish as fools. We must come to see that no individual can live alone. No nation can live alone. We must all live together. We must all be concerned about each other. All this is simply to say that all life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. As long as there is poverty in this world, no man can be totally rich, even if he has $1 billion. As long as diseases are rampant and millions of people cannot expect to have more than 20 or 30 years, no man can be totally healthy, even if he just got a clean bill of health from the finest clinic in America. Strangely enough, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way the world is made. I didn't make it that way, but this is the interrelated structure of reality. John Donne caught it a few centuries ago and could cry out, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, part of the main." If we were to realize the American dream, we must cultivate this world perspective.
Debbie Irving was born in Winchester, Massachusetts. Like many others in her community, she grew up unaware of the political and systemic realities of racial politics that created her sheltered upper-middle-class suburban life. But she did notice how different life was in Boston and the great racial divide that existed there. She began working in urban neighborhoods and schools in Boston in 1984, but couldn't figure out why students' outcomes were so divergent between white students and students of color. She wondered why she felt nervous when talking to people of color, afraid she would say something offensive. After taking a course at Wheelock College in 2009, Debbie Irving began to examine the experiences of her own racial identity and experiences. This deeply personal journey led to her book, Waking Up White, and transformed the focus of her work. We are pleased to welcome racial justice educator Debbie Irving.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and hello, Otterbein University. Thank you for not having a blizzard while I was here. I want to start by thanking the amazing James Prysock, who organized not only my visit here at Otterbein, but an amazing week in the community, and to Judy Guyon-Utzler. I'm not sure if I should be saying pastor or doctor before that. But anyway, thank you to you both. You've really made me feel very welcome and have set me up for success, as we say in teacher world. This is a very complicated holiday for me. I guess I am a realist, and I recognize that there's been progress, and yet in my work as a racial justice educator, I see every day what is still left to be done and the incredibly painful and tragic impacts on those on the wrong end of the racial system. So it's hard for me to be in celebration mode on a day when we're supposed to be celebrating. It's also complicated because I'm a white woman standing here on a national holiday honoring a black man who was fighting for black liberation. So I just want to be right up front about that elephant in the room. That said, I am all in favor of Martin Luther King's dream, where people are judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Is there anybody in this room who thinks that would be a great eventual, actual way to experience the world? If you think yes, just raise your hand. Okay. And also, it's clear to me that we're not there yet. If you also feel that way, would you just raise your hand? Okay, so if so many of us believe in this dream, what's the problem? Why is it so hard to get from here to there? That's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to read a series of questions, and I'm going to ask you just to hold your hand up for a second or two if your answer is yes. So raise your hand if you grew up, lived or live in a neighborhood, or went to a school or a camp where, as far as you knew, it was exclusively white, or where you were the only person of color. Raise your hand if your early education about American history was predominantly about white male historical figures. Raise your hand if you ever encountered media depictions, so media meaning magazines, books, anything online, comics, radio, television, music. If you encountered depictions of Mexicans as drunk, lazy, or illiterate. Of Asians as exotic, cruel, or mysterious. Of Arabs as terrorists or fundamentalists. Of American Indians as drunk, savage, or noble. Of black people as violent or criminal. Raise your hand if you ever noticed that U.S. currency depicts only white men. Raise your hand if you ever witnessed people of color being mistreated in any way by white people. Raise your hand if you ever ate in a public place where all the customers were white, or where you were the only person of color and the other people of color who were present were working there. Raise your hand if you have ever been in a cross-racial friendship that was damaged or lost because of tension or disagreement about racism. Raise your hand if you are white and you were told not to notice or say anything about race, or if you are a person of color and you were taught not to talk openly about race or racism with white people. Raise your hand if there are terms people use when speaking about race that are confusing or seem inflammatory to you. Raise your hand if you find talking about race fraught with potential conflict. I noticed all of these things. I noticed that leadership positions were predominantly, if not exclusively, held by white men. I noticed that service and custodial positions were predominantly black and brown people, occupied by predominantly black and brown people. I noticed that white people held either hateful views or a feeling of pity towards people of color. I noticed that cross-racial conversations and friendships felt tense or awkward. And I noticed that talking about race was a taboo. And this is what I call the arrangement. One I agreed to without even knowing it. We're all exposed to it. The arrangement organizes people around class, race, religion, ability, sexual orientation, and gender, among other things. Race is particularly entrenched for a variety of reasons, including its violent history, the promotion of inaccurate stereotypes, the fact that we cannot change or hide our race, and ongoing housing, education, and voting segregation tactics still employed, both in public agencies and by private institutions. Though, in retrospect, I absolutely noticed the arrangement, I didn't think a lot about it. I was living in a white world with white friends and family where the arrangement was not to be discussed. That was part of the arrangement, was not talking about it. This is a crucial tenet of the arrangement. Often signaled to a small child with just shh when a question gets asked. So in my own childhood, I was left to make sense of all of these observations in my own head, and I quietly developed ideas about white people achieving more because they were smarter, harder working, more together, and more responsible. I would say that my childhood left me with wrongful interpretations. I've spent the past 7 years of my life in conversation with lots of people about the way they were raised in their childhood homes to think and talk or not talk about racism. And it seems to me that most people it's a generalization, most people's households fall into one of 4 categories: bigoted, colorblind, patronizing, or racially fluent. So a bigoted household outright dislikes and has a hatred of other people and their ideas. It's based on race and or religion. A colorblind household uses language like, we're all the same, treat everyone the same, follow the golden rule. A patronizing household says, it's our moral obligation to help and fix and teach people. And you don't usually say the word inferior, but that's kind of implied. Racially fluent households, there's a sophisticated understanding of bias and systems and historical patterns and the language skills that are needed to access all of that. I would call my family, my childhood family, was a kind of hybrid. We were colorblind and patronizing all at once. It was everyone's the same, while at the same time being taught to help others. And that tone of voice just implied a sort of sense of pity, which implies superiority and inferiority. So, as Will mentioned, I grew up in a town called Winchester. It's a suburb just north of Boston. It's an affluent suburb. And this attitude, colorblind and patronizing, were prevailing attitudes there. And then I went to Kenyon College in this very state. So really, until the age of 22, I lived in what I would call a white bubble. After college, I returned to Boston, and I very quickly found myself working in arts administration, where one of my charges was to bring together the many different neighborhoods of Boston. And for the first time, I set foot in neighborhoods that looked nothing like green and leafy Winchester, Massachusetts. I would walk from a white neighborhood full of shiny, happy people into a neighborhood of dilapidated buildings, invariably filled with black and brown people. And they never looked very happy to see me. I wasn't sure if it was me or were they just angry and depressed. The whole thing was very confusing for me, but what really bothered me was that children were growing up with this being their normal in these neighborhoods. And so I wanted to help and fix, and I raised all this money and I created after-school programs. I was sure they needed my help. What I didn't understand was that these segregated neighborhoods that I was judging as needing my help were actually a part of the arrangement. They'd been created by controlling housing and lending policies that advantaged white families like mine at the expense of Americans of color. Resources had been diverted from these neighborhoods and into towns like mine. I didn't know this. I was missing huge chunks of history because I had only been studying white heroes. I'm going to give you one example of something I learned that really made me wake up white. There's a lot I could talk about. I'll share one example. So, in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Authority established the mortgage. Before then, people really had to pay 50 to 100% of a home to buy it. So the mortgage as we know it today was invented in the 1930s, where you can put a small percentage down and pay the rest over time. When the FHA developed the mortgage, they developed a set of guidelines because suddenly private banks are going to be in the business of making loans to people to go buy private homes. So the FHA writes guidelines, and in those guidelines it says, hey, private banks, when you're assessing lending risk, we want you to consider 2 things. 1, the condition of a building. Now that makes sense, right? Who wants to invest in a building that's falling apart? And number 2, the skin color of the residents. So written into government guidelines were these words: the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families can undermine real estate values. So with that government warning, private banks across the country laid out maps of their cities and they began color coding them. It's called redlining. Any area that was outlined in red was a will not lend. And guess who lived there? That was where exclusively black and brown people lived. A Winchester, or even within a city, a white neighborhood, might be outlined in a dark green. And then there were 2 other gradations between red, which was hazardous, do not lend, and dark green, which was best, go ahead, great place, safe place to lend. So my father came back from World War II along with millions of other GIs. And there was a GI Bill waiting, As it was described to me, it was waiting for GIs to welcome them home. It was a sign that this was the way America took care of its own. It offered free higher education and a government-backed mortgage to go buy a home. Government-backed meaning you didn't have to jump through a lot of hoops and show your ability to pay. So I knew that my father had gone to Harvard Law School for free, and I knew that my parents had bought their first home in Winchester, Massachusetts for $17,000 on that GI Bill. What I did not know was that the GI Bill was not accessible to most of the 1 million black GIs. In fact, I did not know there were 1 million black GIs. Where are they in my history books? Where are they in my movies and TV shows? This is what's known as the whitewashing of America through the telling of history and through media depiction. There's a long story about how the GI Bill, it's not that long, but I'm not going to tell you now, the GI Bill system around education obstructed black GIs from accessing higher ed, but it's a little bit like the one I told you about housing. And the reason just to be really clear about it, the reason the black GIs couldn't use the housing portion of the loan was because they couldn't get a mortgage in a dark green neighborhood, because if they were even to be shown a property there, as soon as they moved in, it would no longer be a dark green neighborhood. So the GI Bill would not give them a mortgage in a neighborhood that would have them. So Winchester was not randomly white. Winchester had been made white by intentionally obstructing black and brown people who white people were wrongfully taught to mistrust and fear. To give you a sense of scale, that GI Bill pumped $120 billion into private housing through families. 98% of the people who received that money were white, like my family. And my parents' $17,000 house sold 40 years later for $1 million. The black and brown neighborhoods just 5 miles from my home that I was judging as somehow lacking had been disadvantaged so that people like my family could be advantaged. The people who I was trying to help had gotten the short end of the stick. I had gotten the long end. You cannot have one without the other. It's the inescapable web of mutuality. And by the way, that housing footprint that got laid down in the middle of the 1900s is pretty much intact today. I have found multiple racially divisive policies that have shaped my life and perspective, and that is just one. And when I think about that one alone, I think about the immense impact on my life, materially and psychologically, that it had. Education, health, all of those things, my social network, all of those things were better because I was in a highly resourced community. Now, if I don't understand my history, and I've been taught that race is a taboo topic, how is my conversation going to go with somebody who's been raised in a racially fluent home, or someone who's become racially fluent over the course of their adult life? Not well. I can now see that racially fluent people tried to reach out to me, yet little they said made sense to me. And I think I took the confusion and tension I felt in these conversations, and instead of getting curious and leaning in and learning, I got defensive. In my head, silently, I judged and I retreated, trapping myself in a cycle of silent ignorance. Which is why I want so much to talk about racial fluency. If we think about fluency in the traditional context of learning a foreign language, for instance, why would anybody want to make an effort to become fluent in a language? It's a lot of work, yet people do it. Why do people make that effort? To get to know people beyond their own culture? To connect with different ways of being in the world? To explore new places and see a world beyond what they already know? Isn't that what we have right in front of us in each other, if we can find the language to cross these boundaries? Could it be that language is one of the most important tools we have to break the arrangement that is intended to separate us? To be separated by racial boundaries, cultural boundaries, religious boundaries, and class boundaries, to mention a few. We need language to travel to one another. White privilege perhaps the most misunderstood term I can think of when it comes to this issue. And I just want to clear that up for people who are in this room who might be confused about it. Privilege often is confused with wealth. Privilege, very simply put, is the opposite of discrimination. Now remember I said you can't have a short end of a stick without a long end of a stick. You can't have discrimination without privilege. So could we all agree that people have been discriminated against over time because of a physical disability? So I have able-bodied privilege. Could we say that people in this country have been discriminated against for some religion other than Christianity? So I have Christian privilege. Could we say that people have been discriminated against in this country because of a sexual orientation other than heterosexual? So I have heterosexual privilege. Now, can we say that people have been discriminated against in this country because of what's called a racial category? The way they look, that we described as race. Yes, I've never had to suffer that as a white person, so we could call it racial privilege. It's called white privilege in this country. That's what white privilege means. Doesn't mean I'm rich, though I do happen to have a lot of class privilege, but I don't need to have class privilege to have white privilege. Of all the hardships in my life, none of them are because I'm white. In fact, it was a privilege for me to not have to understand the term white privilege until the age of 48. I don't need to be racially fluent to navigate America's racial system. It's set up so I don't have to understand it. I don't have to know about it. I don't have to acknowledge it. And without racial fluency, conversations derail and old social patterns are reaffirmed, which is why diversity and inclusion initiatives can go off the tracks so easily. When people think about diversity and inclusion initiatives, often they think only about who is and is not populating a space. So if we hear, I wish my church, my campus, my workplace are more diverse, it usually means that those people saying that are white, and diversity means adding more people of color to the community. What's missing in this understanding is that it isn't just about who's in the room, it's about the social norms and values that serve as our common rules of engagement. All of that combined is what I call the arrangement. To drive home this point, think about this. In terms of numbers, plantations were diverse. The rules of engagement were the issue. Those archaic rules in which white people get to decide who is and is not included, when, where, and how, has become so normalized in this society that I didn't even see it until the age of 48 when I took a mandatory teacher education class. So while America becomes increasingly diverse, the same rules of engagement and narrative about white people being more fit to lead is the real task at hand. We can change all the laws and policies we want. We can populate our communities with diverse people all we want. Yet until social order, its origins and power dynamics are understood and addressed, the rules of engagement will perpetuate this archaic social order that all of us have inherited from from white European founders of this country. I was going to say ancestors, and I realized I'm the one up here with European ancestors. So I changed my language. College campuses have the ingredients to be an ideal place to change the arrangement. You're here to learn. Even the faculty is here to learn. Everyone in an education system are lifelong learners, or are learners at least while they're here. So faculty tend to be aggressive learners so that they can keep up with their discipline. So we're all here to learn. We're here to consider new ideas. And for those of you who are students, you're not as set in your ways as someone my age. Your minds are agile. Your ideas are fluid. And think of the campus resources. On this campus, you have sociology, psychology, biology, history, literature, art, and drama. All of these disciplines offer wisdom, knowledge, skills, materials, practices needed to be a vibrant, racially fluent community. And this isn't just any college, this is Otterbein. This is the first institution in the nation to have women as faculty members and students, and have students of color admitted before the Civil War, and who have welcomed Japanese students who were in World War II internment camps, and to have a commitment to the common good, which I have heard isn't just the talk, but is the walk, at least in spirit. Again, we might not be there, but this is really in the DNA of the school. And yet, the arrangement in which we are all so conditioned to uphold, it shows up in every American institution. It's like an infectious disease. It shows up here. I have never met an institution anywhere in this country that it doesn't show up. And that arrangement was never meant for the common good. It was meant to divide the many in the name of diverting access and resources for the few. It goes against all I believe America stands for, and what I know Otterbein stands for, and what Dr. King stood and died for his vision of a beloved community. Well, where do we go from here? Because I can tell you the easiest thing is to go back to the arrangement. It's the easiest thing to do. Group with people who look and think like us and keep those same conversations going without developing the fluency to cross boundaries. So I'm going to leave you with a homework assignment. Has there ever been a speaker who's had a homework assignment? You can tell I'm a racial justice educator. By the end of the year, I'm going to encourage everyone here to be able to answer these questions. What is race? What is racism? Where did the idea of it come from? Find 3 examples of how it has been used to create and perpetuate itself. Describe 3 ways it has impacted your life materially and psychologically. And in the spirit of racial fluency, list 3 terms that you find particularly useful in exploring the arrangement across boundaries intended to hold us apart. And then, and as you're discovering this, come together and share what you're discovering. Conversation is the way human beings think together for the common good. If we can't talk about it, we're not going to make the kind of progress that I know everybody in this room would like to see. Howard Stevenson, who I heard speak recently, it happens to be the brother of Brian Stevenson, Unjust Mercy, who many people may have, or Just Mercy, which some people may have heard of. Howard Stevenson talks a lot about racial literacy, which is really the same thing as racial fluency. I just call it fluency. And he says that it's not a matter of character, it's a matter of competence. We're not bad people because we can't discuss it. It's a skill. We need knowledge and we need skill. And competency requires practice, no matter what we're talking about. And it's no different here. Like learning any new language, you don't wait until you're an expert to start using it. You need to practice. You need to be okay with getting awkward, with making mistakes. Dr. King said the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. And I will tell you that the biggest challenge for me in developing racial competency, racial fluency, waking up to my own history, the biggest challenge for me has been inside of me. It's been the discomfort I feel when conflict comes up. I'm so afraid I'm not going to be able to navigate it. The fear I feel of saying something stupid or offensive. The helplessness I feel when I learn how mistrusted or disliked I might be just because of the color of my skin. The shame I feel of discovering stereotypes and bias still in my subconscious. The struggle I have to reconcile history I wasn't taught and righting wrongs I didn't know existed. But now that I know better, I can do better. I hope that all of you will embrace the idea of studying up on the arrangement and gaining the skills, the language skills necessary to explore crossing boundaries with others without judgment and with the understanding that this is a mutually inherited arrangement that we all have the opportunity and responsibility to change. Thank you for listening.
Otterbein University has a tradition of honoring our guests with a journal. It is our hope that you will use these pages to write the ideas and stories that will continue to challenge and transform the world, one community at a time. Thank you for being with us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much.
I am pleased to once again introduce the Otterbein Gospel Choir.
You thought I was worth saving, so you came and changed my life. You thought I was worth keeping, so you sacrificed your life. You thought I was to die for, so you sacrificed your life, so I can be free, so I can be whole, so I can tell everyone I know. You thought I was worth saving, so you came and changed my life. You thought I was worth keeping, so you cleaned me up inside. You thought I was to die for, so you sacrificed your life, so I can be
honored and privileged to be a part of this celebration. This is our 28th year in existence, and the Otterbein Gospel Choir is truly Martin Luther King's dream in action. We are a non-denominational, every religion, every race, every creed. You are welcome to come and join us on Wednesday evenings at 7 o'clock. Diversity is a faction that does not go out of style. We are yet coming together as people. Thank you.
The Peace and Justice Award was established at Otterbein College in 1996 as a means of recognizing members of our community who exemplify the ideas of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There are 3 categories: Otterbein organization, faculty staff, and student. There are 4 main criteria that are used in selecting the recipients of this award. First, the recipients are individuals or organizations committed to involvement on campus or in the community in ways that serve to balance inequities. Next, through their actions, they encourage others to do the same. The third criteria that recipients exhibit is that they promote equity, equality, and justice in the classroom and/or community. Finally, they demonstrate the principles of nonviolence in solving problems. This year, the Organization Award goes to a Greek organization. This sorority recently voted unanimously to become a gender-neutral organization. Many of their members identify outside of the gender binary and do not use she/her pronouns. The values of this organization are represented in this unprecedented move away from traditional sorority norms as they challenge assumptions and work to shift a long-held paradigm. This year's Martin Luther King Justice, Peace and Justice Award for an Otterbein organization goes to Tau Delta.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
So Katie and I were on our exec board when we came to this decision, and for us it was a no-brainer. It was the right thing to do, and we think that, you know, we're better off for it. There's no reason for, I mean, okay, let's be frank. Greek life was founded on gender and racial segregation, and it's outdated and should not exist, especially at Otterbein, where we say that such things are not allowed and should not be practiced. And so we, just to hold true to that charge, voted on a gender-neutral constitution and
Changed our songs of like 100 years, you know?
yeah, like who needs tradition when it is unethical? So that's all. Thanks.
Our faculty recipient has been on the faculty of Otterbein since the fall of 2013, shortly after receiving her PhD from the University of Minnesota, where she also received a graduate certificate in advanced feminist studies. Anyone who knows her has witnessed her commitment to social justice. One of her nominators writes, "She is willing to ask hard questions and engage in difficult conversations about inequality at Otterbein." A student nominator also noted, "She is honest with us about the inequalities in our society, even though it is sometimes difficult to hear. She is an advocate for marginalized voices and won't back down." We are pleased to announce that the Martin Luther King Jr. Peace and Justice Award for faculty or staff goes to Dr. Danielle Daka-Filipek. Thank you.
As Vice President of the African American Student Union, this student has helped initiate campus conversations on men in the prison system and the intersectionalities that arise in the statistics. He is also the Otterbein liaison for the Midnight Sandwich Run, which is a collaboration of community partners including Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity and Ohio Dominican University. The Midnight Sandwich Run consists of various community entities that come together to make and hand out sandwiches and snacks for the homeless in Columbus. He also worked with his fraternity during fall semester to facilitate an event at Capital University, which included a panel of local activists. Otterbein professors and other community figures that sparked conversations on the plight of African Americans in the United States. He will also be hosting a part 2 of that discussion at Otterbein University this semester to further the discussion and create action items such as building positive relationships with law enforcement to help remove the fear that lies on both sides. This year's award goes to Jordan Hawkins.
I don't like all this picture taking.
For the past 5 years, an added component to Otterbein's Martin Luther King Jr. Convocation has been the MLK Multimedia Essay and Art Contest. Open to the Central Ohio High School students, the contest invited students to consider this year's theme, Network of Mutuality, and Dr. King's word, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. This was taken into consideration by those tasked with judging the numerous entries for the contest. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to announce the 3 winners of the 2016 MLK Multimedia Essay and Art Contest. The winner of the outstanding essay titled A Connected and Harmonious Universe is from Fort Hays Career Center. Congratulations, Dempsey Ewan. Also from Fort Hays High School with a creative art entry titled Growing World, congratulations to Brenna O'Sullivan. And finally, because a multimedia piece was not entered, the next highest score is awarded to a student from Dublin Scioto High School with a beautiful 3D piece titled Identical Hearts. Help me in congratulating Annie Underwood. Let's give all our winners and participants a round of applause.
Thank you for joining us today. It is our hope that this program has met its goal, that you've had the opportunity to rejoice and reflect on the life of Martin Luther King Jr., that you've been challenged and inspired by the words of our keynote speaker, Debbie Irving, and the actions and work of our Peace and Justice Award recipients. We hope that you will leave here knowing that the legacy of Dr. King must extend beyond a day or two of celebration. As Dr. King said, this is not the time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. A couple of announcements. We also invite you to honor Dr. King's legacy by engaging in service. This evening from 5:00 p.m. till 10:00 p.m., the Center for Community Engagement and the Promise House are co-sponsoring an event called Pack the Mac to celebrate the week of Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service. So come to Campus Center, rooms 1, 2, and 3 for a 1-hour shift. Debbie Irving has encouraged us to unpack our privilege. So now you can go to the Campus Center and pack macaroni and cheese. It will go to Warm and to our own food co-op. This is also your chance, your once-in-a-lifetime chance, to show how well you sport a hairnet. Finally, we do invite you to join us immediately following this event in the lobby of Battelle Hall for a reception. There will be an opportunity to meet our 2016 Peace and Justice Award recipients. Debbie Irving will be there to sign copies of her book. We do have a few available for purchase. I hope that you'll join us. I am pleased once again to introduce the Otterbein Gospel Choir as they give their traditional performance of Hallelujah, Salvation, and Glory. And I understand that they will invite alumni to come forward. But where is LaJoyce? Okay, I think we are going to say Hallelujah, Salvation, and Glory, and see y'all at Battelle Hall.